Harold Swift purchased 3 parcels of land in Lakeside in 1923, the sales noted in local newspapers. The house that would become his longtime second home had belonged to Judge Merritt Pinckney and wife Mary.
He bought it from Mrs. Pinckney, who was the wife of a very famous judge. They built that house to retire in, and poor Mrs. Pinckney became a widow.
Swift, sympathetic to Mrs. Pinckney's plight, bought the home for full list price and over years transformed the place into a showcase farm, a place for retreat and relaxation, and to help him help the University of Chicago. The year before, he'd become president of the school's Board of Trustees. At age 40, a champion of consensus who, in his years as trustee, had begun hosting dinners at which faculty members broke bread with the university board, his biographer noting,
Swift frequently presided over the dinner and lent his particular brand of wry humor to the occasion.
Lakeside gave a spectacular new venue for Swift to foster U of C collegiality. Over the quarter century, he would chair the trustees, wielding considerable clout.
One almost gets the sense at some points of the time that Swift is like co-president of the university, not of the board.
His tenure began with big challenges. Just after his ascension to trustee president, University President Harry Pratt Judson retired, perhaps with a nudge from Harold Swift.
I think he stayed too long. He became tired and old.
Trustees selected Ernest DeWitt Burton to replace Judson. Burton and his wife Mary became frequent visitors to Lakeside. The new president brought new energy to campus, launching ambitious new capital projects, Rockefeller Chapel and the medical campus, beginning with Billings Hospital, and Swift Hall on the campus's main quad. But Burton died just 2 years into his tenure.
He said these would be his monuments. He lived to see each of them well started, but neither completed.
Mathematical physicist Max Mason became the first university president chosen from outside the U of C in 1925. Mason, wrote Carroll Russell, was a great deviser of parlor games and wonderful company on weekends in the country, and his young family seemed tailor-made to enter the Swift orbit in Lakeside. But within 3 years, Mason shocked the U of C by leaving to become president of the Rockefeller Foundation. Within a year, though, stability would arrive, in a sense.
On July 1st, 1929, Robert Maynard Hutchins.
Robert Hutchins would serve as U of C president for 22 years. He was young and dashing and happy in the limelight. He gave 64 public talks in just his first year as president. A regular presence on radio and in magazines, he was perhaps America's most famous college president, who said his mission was to, quote, start a big argument about higher education and keep it alive. It was a lot for trustees to cope with, but Harold Swift was a key ally.
I didn't always agree with him, but in my judgment, he had done more for education than any man of his time.
Swift would host Hutchins, his wife Maud, and 2 daughters in Michigan frequently. But Lakeside was not all about U of C business. Carroll Russell wrote of Swift's second home.
It allowed him to avoid social obligations which came with his name. The place was to be an escape for resting and entertaining his friends.
Harold Swift entertained often and lavishly. As Hutchins put it,
all of Harold's friends called him Uncle Harold, and he was just that, a doting, generous, thoughtful uncle who thoroughly spoiled his innumerable nieces and nephews.
The guest book was the best testimony for that. You can see people repeatedly signing in. He had them sign in the guest book. And he himself made these guest books. He took the pictures in his old Kodak camera.
There are 4 such albums, a couple bearing the legend, "This book will be written for Harold H. Swift by his friends." Some friends came year after year. Some were relatives, like his niece Ruth Swift, who married U of C football star Eric Van Ice. U of C trustee colleague Albert Scherer and his family visited often. Little Buddy Scherer would eventually marry into the Russell clan. Charlie Cutter first appeared in the albums in 1925. He and wife Audrey visited often for decades, becoming so enmeshed in Harold Swift's Lakeside world that they were buried in the Lakeside Cemetery, though they never owned Michigan property.
One of the best examples was Norman Barker. They'd met at the University of Chicago, and Barker was a track coach at Long Beach Poly High.
Barker, wife Grace, and son Norm Jr. came every summer, eventually occupying the home that would be dubbed the Hig after Harold Higgins Swift's death. Along with socializing, Norman Barker took charge of the Swift tennis court, arranging matches among guests and giving lessons. He also raked and prepped the beach for Harold Swift's many visitors. But of the hundreds of names and faces in those Swift Farm albums, 2 appear virtually every summer weekend, and frequently in the off-season as well. The very first entry in the first guest book, after an initial weekend with his chief housekeeper Catherine Gruber and Glenn Harding, likely another employee, were Paul and Carroll Russell. The newlyweds had settled into a Hyde Park apartment. Pete, promoted to assistant manager at the Harris Bank in 1923, would later say he liked the neighborhood because it was cheap and interesting. It was also, of course, home to the Swift Mansion and the Mason home on Woodlawn. In March of 1923, Hattie Mason died suddenly. 4 months later, Carol's grief at losing her mother was leavened by the birth of Carroll Duvall Russell. Before little Carol was a year old, the family had moved to a house at 1039 East 49th Street and hired a nursemaid for the baby. And 6 months after that, another namesake baby, Paul Snowden Russell Jr., arrived. Little Carol's baby book notes that she looked forward greatly to little Paul's arrival, feeling it is principally for her. Within a few years, the Russells would get a movie camera, providing glimpses of toddlers Carol and Paul at play at the house on 49th Street, on a teeter-totter with a nanny. Carol making reins of her father's suspenders. Activity on the sidewalk out front. There are photos of family visits to the Swift farm in Lakeside, but the family's principal country getaway destination seems to have been Flossmoor, visiting the recently widowed Arthur Mason at his home Woodyats.
Arthur was very important to me.
He was a fascinating grandfather, his house full of exotica. In the living room, the tale of a lyrebird, a showy Australian specimen.
And he had boomerangs, too, on the wall. And he used to take us out to the golf course across the street and show us how to throw a boomerang.
He told us stories. We loved getting in his bed. And he would tell us stories about Australia. So we want to hear stories about snakes.
He made diplomas from the Woodyats Lyceum to award grandchildren for reading. Paul finishing 2 pages of Daniel Boone. Carol 2 pages of the Pied Piper of Hamelin. There was a garden and farm and pond and lots of open space in the back. Arthur Mason knew the names and songs of all the birds, and
he had a little lab kind of place in the basement.
Because he and his partner had bought a big phosphate mine in Tennessee. He spent a lot of time down there tinkering with his machinery and trying to make a cheaper process.
Young Paul would watch his grandfather's assistant, a Mr. Ehrenberg, measure chemical reactions on phosphate samples, perhaps triggering an early interest in research. While Arthur Mason doted on his grandchildren, his daughter Carol wrote him in 1927, thanking him for a sweet note and adding, "Such expressions of your innermost affections are very rare, and I prize them very much." 4 years after Harold Swift had made Lakeside his weekend home, he made sure his friends the Russells, just welcoming baby Adeline, would be there too. On the bluff just north of the Swift house, the new Russell house rose.
This house was a gift of Uncle Harold in 1927.
The land belonged to Swift, and one of the architects who designed the home was a Mr. Shewey who worked for Swift & Company. Harold Swift gave lodging to many friends over the years. In all, he owned 3 farmhouses and 4 cottages, in addition to the Pinckney house, owning 29 acres in all. But for the Russells, he built new and next door. Sometimes invitations he sent out would include a map showing both his house and the Russell place side by side on the bluff. doors and property lines meant little to the Russell children.
It never occurred to me that his house wasn't mine.
The door was open. I could walk in anytime, just the way we walk into one another's houses here. Carroll would go, I would go. And oftentimes he'd be sitting there for a while, and we would sit down and talk to him.
And I did the same thing here with the farm. Come over, walk in any of the buildings, eat the peaches, never ask anybody's permission to do anything.
Dorothy Swift, in her profile of Harold Swift, says he was called Uncle Harold by many, young and old.
It fits the man and the way he lived. It expresses familial affection at the same time that it captures a slight sense of distance. Swift was an uncle to many, a father to none.
He was a more attentive uncle than most blood relatives, often writing notes of encouragement or congratulations to the Russell children through the decades. Swift took great pains to be the perfect host. Lawrence Kimpton, U of C president in the 1950s, given his own lakeside cottage by Swift, recalled,
"The big old White House functioned with the precision of a Swiss watch. The servants were invisible, but if you left the room for an instant, ashtrays were emptied, papers were neatly folded, and you strongly suspected the place had been vacuumed. All this sounds rather precious and appalling to the ordinary person, and indeed it would have been, except for the warmth and generosity the place exuded."
The staff numbered about 20 at peak season. Eleanor Desmond worked there in the 1940s.
He paid well. He wasn't demanding. He was a good person to work for.
Swift orchestrated kid glove treatment through a head housekeeper, first Catherine Gruber, and in later years Grace Pierce, who lived in the big White House year-round.
Mrs. Pierce was in charge of everything. She was in charge of the house, the help, the menus, the cleaning, the flowers. Every other day or so she had a conference with Mr. Swift about the menu.
The staff knew exactly what they were to do and performed flawlessly.
Meals were the province of cook Stella Parham, who performed culinary miracles in a tiny kitchen and was highly valued.
One time he found that my mom was walking from our house to his, and that was the end of that. Told the chauffeur he picked her up and brought her home.
And when Harold Swift found out Stella's daughter wanted to be a nurse,
he paid for my tuition and for me to go to the nursing.
Swift's longtime chauffeur, Stanley Holmes, used a house just across Lakeshore Road. Otto John was his personal valet for years, and Harold Swift was, without fail, impeccably turned out.
His tastes were conservative, but he liked good clothes and fine furnishings where he lived.
Carroll Russell would write,
"One could never call him effeminate, but he did have qualities of sensitivity to elegant living and physical comforts that were the opposite of rugged individualism."
Harold Swift, by all accounts, was not romantically involved.
I don't know about his homosexuality. It was certainly nothing overt.
The Chickeming Farm, as Swift dubbed it, was overseen for decades by Clarence Cook. He and wife Frances lived there in a home later dubbed Clarence House. Ray Olson was another long-term farm mainstay. In 1970, James Brown IV, a frequent Swift guest, pegged the annual payroll at about $100,000. Clarence Cook assembled a herd of Jersey cattle, cows that won prizes at major livestock shows, and provided high-fat milk that Swift had pasteurized and distributed to his lakeside friends and neighbors in heavy glass bottles. Peacocks roamed the farm. There were exotic pheasants in the birdhouse. The flow of a small creek to the south of the farm was restricted to create a pond where ducks and geese and even swans roamed. In the late 30s, a rabbit house was built to raise animals used in research projects at the university. The gardens Swift had inherited from the Pinckneys were refined and expanded over the years, becoming, like the rest of the farm, a showplace for the enjoyment of guests. Flowers in the garden nearest the house surrounded a copy of the Rodin sculpture, The Thinker. On the far side of the rose-covered trellis were extensive vegetable gardens, along with pastures and fruit trees. A kid could climb into the branches and eat a fresh peach, or pull a carrot rinse it, and consume it on the spot. In 1930, with 3 small children at home, Carroll Russell took an extraordinary trip on her own.
Witch dance. I suddenly knew that fabric and mask belonged together.
I saw a performance of Mary Wiegmann, the German dancer, and I came home sort of walking on clouds, and I told people at the table what an exciting experience I'd had. And this extraordinary man, V, said, "Why don't you go to Germany and study with her?"
She went to Germany with her longtime dance teacher, Mabel Catherine Pierce. She had studied with Pierce for years and sent her children to Pierce's 46th Street studio.
And Mother said, "That's good. You should learn how to move and to express yourself with motion."
She took her firstborn to the Pierce dance camp in Wisconsin when Carroll was just a toddler. She later told an interviewer that as a girl, she alone wanted to dance around the Christmas tree in the Mason home, that she was happy dancing, thinking about it, doing it, and watching others. She'd begun dancing in earnest in college. Movement was her medium, and modern dance became her passion.
And she recognized it as something new and different, a whole new art form, and she found that exciting. She would go to the ballet, but she sort of looked down her nose at the ballet. It was, been done for decades.
What was the reaction of the Midwest banker to his wife's embrace of an avant-garde art form?
And I think he probably congratulated himself that he was so broad-minded.
But he thought she was cute, and that made her sort of mad because she didn't want to be cute. She wanted to be taken more seriously.
I think that's one of the things he really liked about her, was that she had this independent set of interests, which he found they weren't necessarily his interests, but he knew that they were important to her, and he was very supportive of that.
So, in January 1930, Carroll Russell and Mabel Pierce embarked on an ocean voyage to study with Marie Wiegmann.
And had a wonderful time. And the children had whooping cough and all those things. And it almost killed my husband when he came home. He was so lonesome.
Ebullient letters home extolled the benefits of independent travel as
a good thing for any dependent woman. I have made friends entirely on my own, and it has done me good. I really think you'll like me better when I get back.
Signing off,
many kisses. I adore you. P.S. Give my love to all my darling babies.
She wrote little of the nuts and bolts of her experience at the Wiegmann Dance Studio, summarizing the whole experience this way.
Nothing is humdrum or commonplace. Each day is full of surprises and stimulations. If I dwell on it, I'm amazed at myself for ever having been selfish enough to leave you, but I don't let myself dwell on it often.
She never wore a wedding ring, and she went her own way. He liked that in her, that she had that independence.
She would continue to study with Mabel Catherine Pierce and occasionally danced in a Vermont troupe run by Grace and Kurt Graff.
Oh, this is the Graffs. I was in the dance group of Grace and Kurt Graff for a while.
She sometimes toured with them. She and her husband were longtime supporters of the Graff troupe and would become major benefactors of pioneering dancer Martha Graham in time.
At the time, I wasn't sure exactly what it was that kept my mother away from home on occasion, but I knew it was wonderful and important because my father said so.
Paul Russell's passion was banking.
He was enthusiastic about what he did. He said, "Well, my job is wonderful. I love banking because I can do a lot of good." He would come in and sit on my bedside at night. When we would talk about financial things, I could ask him questions. What is a stock? What is a bond?
By 1930, he was a vice president at the bank, on the rise, even as the country was sinking into the Great Depression.
But we were extremely fortunate, and his work at the bank was secure. I remember asking him several times, "Are we going to be all right?" And he said, "Yes."
But in the fall of 1931, Pete Russell was dispatched to New York for several weeks to deal with clearly serious issues for the Harris Bank. His letters home reflected concern.
Let's just be philosophic to a degree. I guess we should be rejoicing that Daddy has a good job at the present time. My darling, you're the apple of my eye and the flower of my life. Cut down all expenses and I'll think you're good.
Still, in 1932, about the time their fourth child, Anne, was born, the Russells bought a new Chicago house at 4901 Greenwood Avenue, a half block from where they'd been living. It was an elegant home, a big living room, a separate sitting room, a dark wood-paneled dining room. In all, 8 bedrooms, 4 full bathrooms, and 2 half baths.
When we bought that house, Peter was doing pretty well. And I never would have dared to spend the money he did. We hired a decorator who got really beautiful things.
The Russell family would grow up at 4901 Greenwood, children growing into adulthood. It was the family's primary address until Pete Russell's death in 1950.
Well, it was a very happy household, I would say.
Shortly after moving into the new home, little Adeline came down with rheumatic fever. Thin to begin with, she lost appetite and weight and developed heart troubles and fever.
She was frail and pale, and everybody treated her as though she was kind of an invalid. She had to have Vichy water and cream.
Finally, Lindy was sent to La Rabida, a children's sanitarium nearby, renowned for its treatment of rheumatic fever. Her mother writing,
She has been in bed 2 months at home and stays in the sanitarium 5 weeks. Her parents are allowed to visit her only 1 hour on Sundays. Soon, the 6-year-old, so weak she'd had to be pushed around Lakeside in a baby buggy, was splashing in the lake with her siblings.
By any measure, a family with 2 homes and servants who cared for the kids while the parents vacationed were well-to-do.
It didn't occur to me that we were rich. I didn't know that. We always lived comfortably, but we were never to take it very seriously. It wasn't because we deserved all this.
Amid abundance, Carroll Russell's worldview was abstemious.
It was a matter of philosophy. It had nothing to do with money. You don't surround yourself with things you didn't need. There were so many people who needed things.
It became a family joke that a gift could never be exchanged because it had always been bought on sale. Mother never purchased a single piece of string. It was routinely collected from parcels that came into the house.
Despite his occasional pleas for parsimony, Pete Russell loved to spend on some things.
Peter always adored to buy millions of Christmas presents for me.
Every Christmas, he would give her a great big box from a fancy lingerie place. And he would just load her up with beautiful things, and she would love it.
And Pete Russell treated himself to the tech of the time.
He got very excited with the point-and-click camera, and he loved that. Any new gadget, he would always get the newest of everything. It would make him happy.
Harold Swift had helped set the Russell family up financially and socially.
Uncle Harold put the family in the social register, and I think my father thought that was great. My mother tolerated all that, but wasn't as interested in any of those things as he was.
Swift himself continued to work at the family meatpacking house as a vice president, the family's only college man, a burden as well as badge of honor, according to biographer Dorothy Swift.
His normal reticence about his own accomplishments was reinforced by the teasing of family members, who had to go straight out of high school into the family business.
In 1931, Harold Swift wrote an article for Survey Graphic magazine about Swift & Company's efforts to give its workers regularized work schedules, urging empathy for employees in an industry with a history of squalid working conditions. He was known for a strong moral compass. As Robert Hutchins put it at his funeral, there was no twilight zone of honesty and integrity in business. In 1922, Swift wrote a U of C official, embarrassed to discover a Swift & Company salesman had tried to leverage Harold's role as a university trustee to win U of C business. Swift urged that the matter be handled on its merits, irrespective of my business interests. Swift and the trustees would be mightily tested in the 1930s. Along with charisma and intellect, Robert Hutchins brought controversy to the University of Chicago. His overhaul of the university's curriculum upset some alumni, but not Pete Russell. Hutchins called Pete the most popular U of C alumnus and recalled meeting him in Lakeside in 1929.
He sat on the floor in Harold Swift's living room and talked about the university in a way I had never heard any alumnus, and certainly no football-playing, bond-selling alumnus, talk about his alma mater before. He was interested in education and educational ideas, and he wanted to know what the University of Chicago could do about them.
Carroll Russell wrote, right from the start, there was
mutual admiration between the educator and the bond salesman. He gave Hutchins strong support and some comfort later when he was surrounded by criticism and was a burden to some of the trustees.
In the mid-1930s, the U of C came under attack from anti-communist activists. Congressman Hamilton Fish claimed, "Sentiment at the Midway is ultra-modern, communist, in fact." Chicago's Hearst newspapers, the Herald Examiner and the American, beat the drum loudly, warning radicalism was flourishing on campuses, particularly in Chicago. Editorials warning, "Keep your boy or girl from red plague hotspots." And the U of C was put squarely in the anti-red crosshairs by Charles Walgreen, the drugstore magnate, who pulled his niece Lucille Norton from the university, writing to Hutchins,
"I am unwilling to have her absorb the communistic influences to which she is so insidiously exposed."
The Walgreen letter, as the headlines put it, was a bombshell. It put the trustees, which as of the year before included Pete Russell, on the spot, particularly board chair Harold Swift.
Swift strikes me as a very decent guy who wanted to protect the university reputation, but who also understands you bring a bunch of talented faculty together, you can't really tell them what to think, and some of them are going to embarrass you. I mean, it's just going to happen.
Walgreen accused Professor Frederick Schumann of advocating a communist doctrine of free love. Professor Maynard Kruger had been in headlines for leading socialist rallies. Professors Paul Douglas, later elected to the U.S. Senate, and Robert Morse Lovett also gave voice to left-wing views. Trustees heard from upset alumni. One telegram saying, "The university is suffering from Hearst attacks. Do something." Harold Swift's brother Charles received an anonymous letter decrying his supposed support for disloyal academics, signed, "Truly yours and sincerely an American," perhaps prompting Charles to ask his brother Harold for precise definitions of terms like socialism and communism. Robert Hutchins responded to critics with a ringing defense of academic freedom, saying,
"A professor is not disenfranchised when he takes an academic post. He may join any church, club, or party."
Harold Swift created consensus to back Hutchins up. Not always easy. Many trustees, like Pete Russell, were businessmen, often quite conservative.
He had a board that if you had put up academic freedom for a vote, there would have been a minority for it, a strong minority, very dubious, and then a kind of a uncertain middle that if it doesn't embarrass the university is okay.
Illinois state senators convened hearings focusing on radicalism on the U of C campus. Hutchins and Walgreen were the headliners. Trustees backed Hutchins through Harold Swift's testimony.
"I have no hesitancy in affirming that I am entirely convinced that there is no communistic teaching in the university and that no member of the university faculty is a communist. I am convinced that no faculty member advocates the violent overthrow of the government nor tries to instill such ideas in the minds of the students."
Trustees supported Hutchins' refusal to fire controversial professors. While the senator heading the U of C investigation proclaimed the university a hotbed of red thinking, the Senate declined to extend his investigation, and the Hearst papers decried the smothering of the probe. Harold Swift was pilloried by right-wing activists. U of C alumna Elizabeth Dilling included Swift as one of 1,300 dangerous radicals in her book, The Red Network, pointing out he'd been on a Red Cross mission to Russia during World War I, and that the U of C, under his leadership,
retains communistic profs, recognizes communistic student activities, and allows its property to be used for communist meetings in violation of Illinois sedition laws.
In the newspapers, Dilling called Harold Swift
a radical of the cream puff type. Harold would get his throat cut if the revolution came, but he talks for it anyway.
Since others on Mrs. Dilling's list of communists included New York Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia and First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, her view was not mainstream. But Carroll Russell would write of Swift,
I know that he suffered under the burden of responsibility and was often exhausted by the passion of academic defenses and opinions in the 30s and 40s.
University historian John Boyer says Swift's decency, intelligence, and courage were fully visible in his defense of academic freedom. When confronted with the accusation that communism was taught at the university, Swift would reply, "Yes, and we teach cancer in the medical school." During a later Red Scare in the 50s, he patiently explained to someone who urged banning left-wing groups from campus that such groups actually attracted more students when forbidden by campus authorities.
It isn't wise to tell young people these days what they may do or may not do, and if an authority attempts to do so, it simply fans the flame and increases the fire.
Though Swift had backed Robert Hutchins to the hilt, Hutchins was in Lakeside less and less as the 30s went on, though Hutchins' daughters sometimes stayed with their Uncle Harold while their parents, whose marriage was dissolving, traveled. Indeed, Franya Hutchins was a featured player in a Lakeside tradition that took root in 1934, plays performed by the Russell kids and their friends.
Carroll was a spark plug, of course, for this.
Carroll Russell wrote and directed The Interrupted Boar Hunt, a play performed in the Swift Gardens. She had been an organizer almost right out of the crib. When little brother Paul was born, her mother wrote that it was her toddler's strong social instinct that led her to believe the new baby was principally for her. When Adeline was born, her mother wrote Carroll a letter encouraging her to be her best grown-up 4-year-old self in her mother's absence, adding drawings of the baby's impending arrival at home. At 8, her mother wrote, Carroll was a capable, clear-headed little manager. And when her sister Anne was born in 1932, Carroll was horrified the baby's name was to be Johanna. She marched off to see her Uncle Harold Swift and returned suggesting the new baby be named Anne in honor of Harold's mother instead. She got her wish. Also in 1932, Carroll organized an outing to Flossmoor for her school friends, members of what was dubbed the Work and Play Club. Carroll sent out detailed invitations and agendas. The event, written up charmingly for the Flossmoor newspaper by her uncle Jack Mason.
The following schedule, prepared in advance by the president of the club, was unanimously endorsed by the members and carried out to the letter. 1. Go to the farm. 2. Feed the fishes if the pond is not frozen. 3. See the chickens at my grandfather's house. 4. Ride horses. 5. Climb in the hay. 6. Play with the police dogs. 7. See the pigs.
2 years later, Carroll organized the first Lakeside play, her mother recounting her 11-year-old's
curtain-raising speech to the effect that a collection will be taken after the play and the money given as some sort of memorial to Melvin.
Melvin Cook, the 10-year-old son of the Swift farm foreman, had drowned just weeks before. The Interrupted Boar Hunt charmed and amused its audience, particularly the casting of 5-year-old Adeline as the killer.
Disguised by an old-fashioned broom bag through which the tip of her nose protrudes in a most ludicrous fashion.
The playwright further delighted her mother by including a Dance of the Christmas Angel in the production.
Our parents thought that was good, and it should be encouraged. So then, of course, they built the playhouse in back of the big house.
The Greenwood Theater was constructed 125 feet in front of the big house front door and was the site of the next original production, based on an English short story, The Defective Detective.
Neighbors' car lights served to illumine evening performances, and audience attention was divided between actors and mosquitoes.
Carroll would continue to stage plays in Lakeside for decades, first casting siblings and friends, then later generations of junior thespians who often did not fully grasp the humor of the lines they spoke. The original Russell house would be added on to several times to accommodate the growing family. Porches widened, a kitchen eating porch added, the narrow window in the master bedroom becoming a huge picture window. In 1932, big bedrooms, known as the girls' dorm and boys' dorm, were added to the north end of the house, freeing up a bedroom for Adeline Mayo, Granny, Pete Russell's mother. And just north of the main house, the playhouse went up. Not for the plays the kids were putting on, but as a spot for occasional lunches and other entertaining, and to give children approaching teenage years a little extra space. It was inaugurated with a square dance called by Mr. Smith, the barber from New Buffalo. Sisters Carol and Lindy spent parts of several summers in Wisconsin, dancing at Mabel Pierce's camp on Washington Island.
Getting there was a full day's drive, followed by a long ferry ride. The island in those days was a very primitive place. We had no running water and no electricity, which meant that we lived very close to nature. Our camp was not a competitive sort of camp. It was an arts camp.
The girls loved the nature, the camaraderie, and the dancing. Lindy growing so enamored of the camp that she asked to stay longer, writing her father, Daddy Waddy, that she was having a good time, adding, "I wish you and all the other mugs were here." Her affection for dance on the Pierce camp was long-lived. As a 21-year-old, she served as assistant director of modern dance at the camp on Washington Island, an appointment noted in the Chicago Sun-Times. Back in Lakeside,
well, I was loose on the property, of course. My father was concerned that I should have some kind of structure. So he hired a guy, college-age guy, to come out and teach me the martial arts.
Paul tried to pass on his interest in nature.
And my brother would make me stand there and try to memorize the birds, and he would swat me if I'd get one wrong.
And got a gentler introduction to nature in Michigan from her mother.
She did teach me wildflowers. We used to tramp around in the woods. She told me the difference between a spring cress and a spring beauty. That was important to me, too. I loved the same things.
As the family grew, the younger children felt their parents were less engaged with them.
Mother clearly found the two older children more interesting than the younger children, which bothered me a little bit.
She wasn't going to guide me at all. She was going to hope that I was as independent as she was.
Carol Sr. began spending a few weeks each summer dancing with the Graff Troupe. Sometimes her daughter's letters from their dance camp in Wisconsin would go to Carol at the Bennington School of Dance. When in Lakeside, the Russells loved sports.
They both loved to play games for entirely different reasons. Dad played golf to win. Mother, although a champion, played because it meant she could be with him. She could listen to bird songs, collect wild mushrooms, and eat them on the way to the next tee. She knew what they were. Incidentally, she always drove from the men's tee.
Carroll Russell was a 5-time Chickiming Country Club golf champion and won club tennis trophies as well. Pete, though hobbled by gout, was the Chickiming men's golf champ in 1943.
I would caddy for him occasionally at the golf course here. That is the closest personal one-on-one contact that I can remember having with him.
Pete Russell was, mostly, a weekender. The Russell home on Greenwood Avenue would close for the summer for repainting and other repairs.
He used to spend his summers with Harold Swift and Harold Gordon at the Blackstone, and they would drive over on Friday evening in his limousine, and we'd all be there Friday evening to greet them.
Harold Swift would weekend throughout the year, pretty much every weekend after Memorial Day, and setting aside a full-time stay of 2 or 3 weeks in midsummer. He entertained constantly.
He always had people there, and I think it was a wide variety of friends, too.
Guests logged in books specially made for Swift by a fellow university trustee who ran the Donnelly Printing Company. Harold Swift still assembling the photos himself. Some guests signed in artistically. Chicago Tribune cartoonist John McCutcheon drew a caricature of his family arriving, and artist Lawrence Beal Smith often drew cartoons when he signed in. In middle age, Swift focused on hospitality, writing in the 1940s,
I used to enjoy tennis. Now I like to watch it as long as I don't have to chase the balls. I like gardening as long as I don't have to do it. I like raising cattle as long as I don't have to do the work.
In earlier years, Swift had actually won a local doubles tennis championship with his friend Kitty Gordon, and there are photos of him golfing with Pete Russell and others. But by the 30s, except for trips to the beach, Harold Swift was rarely dressed for action.
He himself was an elegant person. He was very well turned out. His clothes were beautiful. For example, he had these brown and white shoes that had to be polished just right.
Oh yes, always dressed in a coat and tie. I can't remember seeing him in anything less.
Dinners were often formal, food prepared by Stella Perham in a cramped kitchen with no air conditioning.
Stella would go into that little cubby hole and she would come out with a meal. You wouldn't hear a dish rattle.
Entertainment almost always included games of bridge, morning, afternoon, and evening sessions. Knowing the game seemed a prerequisite for an invitation to the Swift farm. Frequent guests all seemed to enjoy it. In the mid-1930s, Carroll Russell's role as a patron of modern dance entered a new phase. As Martha Graham recalled later,
I had a studio at 66 Fifth Avenue. One day, this young woman walked into the studio and said, "Martha should appear in Chicago." The secretary said, "Yes, she should, but we have no money to pay for it." Carroll said, "I'll pay for it." Carroll was determined that my dance was going to Chicago.
I came home and rented the Studebaker Theater on 9 Union in those days and brought Martha Graham for a performance.
Martha performed the dance Frontier at that first Chicago show.
It wasn't a very big audience.
Music by Louis Horst, who would later collaborate with Carroll Russell on a book about dance. Set design by Isamu Noguchi. For decades, a small recreation of that set sat on the fireplace mantel of the Russell home in Lakeside. Correspondence shows Martha Graham frequently turning to her friend Carroll for financial help. In October 1937, she wrote she was in difficulties, asking,
"I wonder if you would lend me some money. I allowed myself to be impulsive, and I shirked my responsibilities last year."
A couple of weeks later, a thank you letter said Carroll's money had, quote, tided me over a very precarious moment.
She was very warm with Mother, and well, she should have been. Mother supported her.
One Martha Graham thank you note from the 50s said Carroll's gift was particularly meaningful because, quote, you are a dancer. A dancer is a celebrant of life.
Martha came several times to the house.
During one such Chicago visit, medical student Paul Russell found himself pressed into Martha's service.
So I took Martha upstairs to the second floor and gave her an injection. Steroids. It was years before anybody knew anything about steroids. I don't think they were ever used in athletics.
Just after the Russell-sponsored first Chicago appearance, Graham made headlines by turning down an invitation to an international dance festival to be held in Berlin in conjunction with the 1936 Olympics. She denounced Nazi persecution of artists. But her Chicago patrons, the Russells, attended that dance festival and Olympics in 1936. They had traveled often over the years, leaving their children with nannies. Winter trips to warm climates helped Pete Russell's health.
They'd go away for a month in the wintertime, someplace in Arizona, for a Camelback Inn or something.
When their fifth child, Harold, was but a toddler, the Russells embarked on an extended European tour with several friends. They sailed over on the ocean liner Rex to Italy, returning from London aboard the Queen Mary several weeks later. In between those voyages, the group wound its way in leisurely fashion through Austria, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, before winding up in Germany for the Olympics. The Chicago Tribune Society pages mentioned their trip, describing Carroll Russell as a professional dancer with 5 children, adding,
"As a dancer, Mrs. Russell wants to see other dancers and their dances. And as the wife of Pete Russell, famous University of Chicago athlete and All-American quarterback in 1916, she is looking forward to the Olympic Games.
The Games, of course, were a showcase for the Nazi regime, and Russell family photos reflect it. Troops marching through Berlin's streets. The Zeppelin, the Hindenburg, replete with swastikas, flying overhead. And in the Olympic Stadium, many arms upraised in Nazi salutes as the torch entered, inaugurating the Games. Daughter Anne later recalled that Pete Russell, when the German anthem was being played, gave a Nazi salute, drawing a rebuke from his wife. His response, "I'm a guest in their country and I will be polite." The Russells' views of current affairs often diverged.
Our mother, of course, was way off the charts in the liberal category, and our father, being a banker, he thought Roosevelt was on the wrong track.
My father was a clear Republican, my mother was a Democrat. And I remember when Wilkie was running against Roosevelt, that at my end of the table, we were for Wilkie. At the other end of the table, my mother was for Roosevelt. And of course, I was for Wilkie because that's what my father wanted to do.
They would discuss issues of that sort quite often and in front of the whole family. But we never had the notion that they were at odds with each other over much of anything.
There wasn't any heightened voices that would not be seemly, and our parents were both seemly.
My father would hold forth about his business day. He enjoyed his work a great deal, and I think wanted to tell people about what an interesting day he'd had.
And then the University of Chicago was an important common interest.
Pete and Carroll Russell were enthusiastic participants in the Great Books seminars led by Robert Hutchins and Mortimer Adler in the 1940s, and frequently hosted faculty.
They had a Sunday evening supper pretty much every week, and almost invariably one or two university professors were invited.
It was a heady atmosphere for children, and we were encouraged to participate.
In 1939, Pete Russell, U of C football star turned trustee, faced a difficult choice. He and Harold Swift continued to be big football boosters. The guest lists for Swift's train trips to away games had grown immense and always included the Russells. As late as 1938, Pete reported to Swift that the annual football dinner was the best ever. But, as his wife put it,
each season was an increasingly depressing experience.
In 1939, Chicago was shut out in all 4 games against Big Ten opponents. Other Big Ten schools were spending far more on sports than Chicago. And Robert Hutchins, who had cheered the decision of his alma mater Yale to scale down football in the early 30s, now told trustees they had but 2 choices: subsidize players like other Big Ten schools, or discontinue intercollegiate football. Hutchins argued upping football subsidies would mean
departing from our principles and losing our self-respect. We must therefore discontinue the game.
Hutchins saw this decision as an iconic decision. It was almost it was an ethical decision. It was a moral decision.
Harold Swift drafted a proposal that football be scaled down but not eliminated, arguing elimination would reinforce the unfavorable opinion that the college was interested only in scholarship, at the expense of the arts and athletics. But in the end, he and the trustees backed Hutchins. There was backlash, particularly from older alumni. Ignominious and ignoble, thundered a 1914 grad.
My Peter was very much on the spot with his old friends, but defended the decision with 100% agreement with its good sense.
By the late 30s, the 2 oldest Russell kids had been sent off to boarding schools, Carroll to St. Mary's in the Mountains in New Hampshire, and Paul to Groton near Boston. All 5 children would go first to lab school and then on to a prep school in the East. Their father frequently wrote notes to his children, signing his name simply D, a bit of shorthand that would become his moniker for grandchildren. In 1941, Adeline Kidd, Pete's mother, racked by arthritis, came to live with the family after her husband died.
She was a very practical person. She didn't want us to get high-flown ideas. If I had a black tie and I was going to a debutante party, and that was when she said, "You're going out with the count of no account."
Granny, as she was known, had a bedroom on the second floor in Chicago, moving Paul up to the third floor with the servants when he wasn't away at school. Harold Swift made major revisions to his home in Lakeside in 1941, adding a wing to the north that included a multi-car garage and more rooms for the home's staff, and adding art to his estate's gardens, a work by Hyde Park sculptor Sylvia Shaw Judson, the daughter of architect Howard Van Doren Shaw, who had designed the Mason home on Woodlawn. It was a likeness of Swift's 6-year-old namesake, Harold Russell. The onset of World War II did not change the rhythms of Lakeside very much. It did not lead Pete Russell to recount his experiences in the last European conflict at any length, though he did set up a map of Europe in the family dining room in Chicago.
He would every day move the pins to mark the front lines as we advanced in Europe.
Young Carroll Russell, studying to become a nurse, took on the duties of an air raid warden.
And she had a helmet which she would put on and go out and walk around the neighborhood and mark down any house that had not pulled its shades.
In the spring of 1944, Carroll was engaged to Albert Scherer, long a presence in the Swift-Russell Lakeside orbit. As Buddy Scherer, he'd come with his parents to visit Harold Swift for decades. His father, a member of the Deke fraternity and university trustee, like Pete Russell and Harold Swift. Bud Scherer had flown 30 bombing missions as a navigator in the Pacific and was on furlough when he and Carroll married in Chicago in October 1944. Honeymooning briefly in Lakeside, whimsically signing the Swift guest book as Honeymoon Hotel, before he returned to duties as a flight instructor in Arizona and Florida, where she joined him later. In December 1945, just after the war's end, Harold Swift greatly added to his gift of Lakeside, sending Carroll and Pete Russell the deed for the land on which their home stood, about 240 feet of lakefront, valued at the time at $75 per foot, or about $18,000. Just days later, in early 1946, Pete Russell would be named president of the Harris Bank, at the time the nation's 31st largest, with assets of $490 million. The Chicago Tribune wrote,
Russell, known to secretaries and counting house kings alike as Pete, is 52 years old.
And he probably knew everybody by name, and they knew him, and he was accessible. He knew what it was like to work in the lower echelons at the bank, and he paid attention to their needs.
He had a special gift for people. Everybody loved him.
Newspaper accounts played up Pete Russell's rise from humble bank messenger to president, as well as his athletic past. Columnist Irv Kupcinet wrote that Pete Russell compared his work to quarterbacking.
You've got to have teamwork. You've got to have good blocking to pave the way for the ball carrier.
The Harris Bank's official history noted,
when he took over the presidency of what was a prestigious commercial bank in 1946, he did so with a rich set of contacts in the Chicago business community.
Perhaps his most important contact, of course, had been Harold Swift.
And he said when he came home, after he became president, he really didn't want it after all. Although he worked all his life to get it, he said he did. And I think one of the reasons was he had a boil on his behind. And he had to smile and be gracious to all these congratulations, and he felt awful.
Pete Russell's distress perhaps on his mind that day when a reporter asked his assessment of the world economic situation.
It's like a boil you have to sit on for 4 or 5 days. Darn painful and disagreeable, but it clears up.
4 months later, the Russells' first grandchild, Peter Scherer, arrived, just as his family was embarking on a great adventure.
The city was full of smugglers and other miscreants.
So begins Carroll Scherer's description in her memoir of Tangier, Morocco, her family's first foreign service posting. Smugglers and miscreants drawn to Tangier because it was an international city, currencies from all countries honored, a free trade zone and tax haven attractive to swindlers and black marketeers. Life in post-war Tangier, especially with a toddler, was hard.
Electricity and water were a constant problem.
The Scherers' first house lacked closets and reliable heat.
They were struggling. They had to make a life in a place that was very strange.
The Scherers' letters home were reliably upbeat, though Bud Scherer did ask his parents for a gun for Christmas.
The Moors are far from dangerous, but they are frightfully inquisitive and might alarm Carol if she is ever there alone. I would feel better if she had something to scare away any intruders.
Within 3 months of arriving, the Scherers learned that baby number 2 was on the way. Paul Russell, on a break between medical studies and his internship, visited Tangier in 1947. His letters home, to his parents and his most special uncle Harold, included his opinion that the local hospital's facilities were up to snuff for birthing delivery. Susan Scherer, as it turned out, was actually born in a nurse's residence next to the hospital run by missionaries. Indeed, Bud and the doctor had to break down a door to get Carol a room to give birth in.
The holy people contended they were all out there expressly to serve the local population and nobody else.
Pete Russell sent his daughter letters of encouragement, sometimes accompanied by money. In one such letter, he suggested that she write, anonymously or nom de plume, an account of her experiences in Morocco to earn some money, enclosing what he called an advance royalty. Carol was eager for family visits, writing, "Daddy must come," in one letter. And in 1948, she got her wish. Her father got a new passport, Harold Swift, listed as emergency contact, and went with his wife and daughter Lindy, first to Portugal, then to Spain, where they met up with Carol before heading on to Morocco. The visit served as a morale boost for one daughter, a distraction for another. Lindy had struck up a romance with Mace Winnegar, but her parents did not see Mace, handsome and artistic, as marriage material. So they invited their daughter to visit Europe and Morocco with them in the fall of 1948 and suggested she then stay on with the Scherers until mid-49. After her parents had returned to Chicago, Lindy got a letter from her father describing a 3-hour conversation with Mace, who said he hoped to get engaged when she returned.
I attempted to say,
wrote Pete Russell to his daughter in Tangier,
what I thought any good father should say. I had no control over love.
Though he went on,
the first obligation of a man thinking of marrying is to make a living for himself and provide security for a family before he attempts to have one. Mace says he's looking into the business of architectural something or other. In the language of the street, it's probably known as interior decorating. I am not particularly reassured when he suggests you must bring home some of the bacon. I can see more reasons for caution than haste.
Lindy's interest in Mace may have been waning by then anyway. She'd struck up a romance with Bob Caldwell, one of Bud's State Department colleagues in Tangier. Pete and Carol Russell had now been married for more than a quarter century. On their 25th anniversary in 1947, Carol had written a poem, a tribute to her husband.
Peter the Rock is the foundation stone of a house and a family.
Pete enjoyed reporting family news to his children in a playful, sometimes sarcastic tone. In November 1949, he sent out a family bulletin about Lindy's appendectomy, assuring his children she was doing a Martha Graham down hospital hallways shortly after surgery. And he then added that his wife had bought a painting from a British artist named Hancock, her boyfriend, he said. Quote, "A most beautiful watercolor you ever saw of some other person's washing on the line. I love laundry. Really, I'm quite a dilettante." That painting would hang in the Russell Lakeside living room for years, though Pete Russell would not live to see it there. Within a month of Lindy's appendectomy, her father was hospitalized.
I remember his leaving the noon meal on Christmas Day and going upstairs. And the next thing I know, he was coming down on a stretcher.
The Tribune reported respiratory problems had hospitalized Pete Russell in December '49, but it was an apparent heart attack that killed him a few days into 1950. The Sun-Times called him one of Chicago's favorite success stories. The Daily News lamented, by all standards save achievement, Pete was a young man. The papers recited his civic leadership posts, his years of work on behalf of the University of Chicago, and looked back on his humble start in the banking business as a $10-a-week messenger. His daughter Carroll contended he'd hidden earlier angina attacks from his banking colleagues. The Harris was shocked by his death.
He was president for only 4 years, but there were people years later, I know two, who carried his picture in their wallet because he was their hero.
Carroll Russell would write that her husband
literally destroyed his health by the pitch at which he worked. He knew he went too hard, but preferred to live that way rather than cautiously and longer.
But it may be that the gout that slowed him throughout his adult life put him on a diet that proved fatal.
He was not allowed to have protein. He couldn't have meat, so he ate eggs. But of course, that's loaded with cholesterol, and I think that could have contributed to his heart problem.
Neither Carroll Russell nor Harold Swift spoke at the funeral service at Rockefeller Chapel on the university campus. Robert Hutchins, no longer U of C president but still the chancellor, gave the funeral oration, praising Pete Russell as plain-spoken and fond of teasing, but adding,
"He was kind to everybody. If you were vainglorious, he made you understand in the nicest way that he was aware of it. If you were depressed, he would tell you all the fine things you were doing and induce you to believe it. If a good executive is one who can make his associates better than they would otherwise be, Pete Russell was one of the best executives I have ever seen."
Hutchins' eulogy concluded, "I think of Pete Russell as one who was faithful to his youth."
And that felt just right. It was what made him special, one of the things that made him special. In a way, some people get older, they think older. They think like old people. They think like people who have compromised. He did not compromise. He kept that zest in his spirit, even though he was not firm in his body. He had a sparkle to him and an enthusiasm to the very end.
Paul Russell left $1,000 to his longtime secretary at the bank, Peggy Wright, a few thousand to his brother John and John's family, and $5,000 to the university. The rest went to his family, who gathered to bury his ashes on the beach in Lakeside soon after his funeral.
I tried to dig a hole. The beach was frozen, and it wasn't easy to dig a hole because it was really frozen. So we didn't do a terribly good job of that, but they were spread around down there.